And I'm struck, you said somewhere in all this conversation that there is a difference between the formal language of the tenets, for want of a better word, I like that word, or the texts, as it were.
Mm, mm,
Then there is actually maybe the modern parlance or interpretation that's actually live in the rooms.
yeah.
Um, but that almost feels to me like that's actually what goes on if you come across a vibrant church in a funny sort of way. Actually, that
Absolutely.
actually
Yeah.
that actually somehow the language inside the building and even the way the building might look sometimes doesn't have
Mm,
all that same formal austerity, well, as I would associate with the church that's literally,
mm,
50 yards down my road, which is a,
mm.
a, a massive grey Victorian Church of Wales building that on a Sunday only has 5 people in. But I can go to 4 or 5 churches in Bangor that have 250 people in the room, and it seems
Mm.
to me that it's the one that's changed or given room. To embrace more that's alive, and you're saying something that's what the 12-step movement has done somehow here. Um,
Well, yes. I mean, it's really interesting, though, because, sometimes I'm really struck by how conservative the 12-step movement is, in the sense
okay.
that, the book, what they call the big book,
Yeah, yes.
first 164 pages, has remained the same since the 1930s. They've got new stories they periodically publish, new editions that have
Mm.
got updated stories in them. But what they call the program of recovery in the first 164 pages is the same. And in that language, you've got that very Protestant Christian God language. You've also got, what I would call patriarchal language. The alcoholic is always male. So there's a chapter addressed to wives. So you've got, assumptions about nuclear family and
Yeah.
heteronormativity and all kinds of things that are, deeply, deeply problematic, I think. But the text, nobody well, the way Alcoholics is Anonymous is organised, it's very unlikely that that will ever change.
Mm.
And the argument that's made is that, this has worked generation after generation. So if we change it, we're capitulating to, um, whatever the social reality is at any
Mm.
given time. So it's better to keep it as it is, but assign people the freedom to interpret it however they want. So,
A bit
it's
like treating it
really,
like a sacrament almost, isn't it?
wow, yeah. Yeah, yeah. I think there are so many kind of similarities there that,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, that's absolutely fascinating. And I mean, I sometimes think, well, they've retranslated the Bible to make it less patriarchal, to make the
Mm.
language less exclusive, but they won't retranslate the big book. They won't change that
Mm.
language in the big book. They'll keep it the same. So in a sense, they're more conservative, um, than, than lots of Christianity. Um, but
So a
but
lot of your
that's the
study is how groups, individuals and groups are therefore navigating that
Yeah,
position, really, isn't it?
yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And I guess I would want to always argue that you can't understand any religious or spiritual group by only looking at their written sources. You have to have
No,
the
sure.
ethnography as well, and to see how the two relate. And I think that's one reason why, people are so anxious about 12-step fellowships, is because they think the writing is what it is, and they don't realize there is a live and vibrant community around these writings that are reinterpreting
Sure.
it.
And
They're changing the language, they're making it make sense to them as embodied,
Yeah.
gendered beings, you know, in the present day with their experiences.
And they would have to. I mean, you know, the recovery community that I'm involved with, and we've already interviewed James as part of this series. Is well, we're a, you know, it's a. I was going to use the expression. Yeah, well, I will use it. It's a, you know, at the moment the residential unit is a mixed rehab unit, and that's more than two genders, you know, probably.
Yeah,
So
yeah, yeah, yeah,
it's
yeah,
like, you know, just for starters, let alone anything
yeah,
else that we might want to
yeah,
add. So it's a necessary requirement, isn't it? Really.
yeah,
Um,
yeah,
you know, and especially if we want to cross over and make the extra connection that very often some of the individuals that get involved in drink and drug use are themselves excluded because some of all of those other characteristics outside of that norm anyway. So their
yeah, yeah.
experiences are anything but the norm, of course.
Yeah, yeah, and people are marginalised on multiple levels, multiple
Mm.
intersections, aren't they, of
Yes.
marginalisation, and where you've got more marginalisation, you've got more addiction. So,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. I mean, there has to be that freedom for
Yeah.
people to read those
Yeah.
texts in
Um,
their own way.
I'm struck listening to you that some of this made a lot of sense to me. Maybe a good 10 years ago, maybe even a tiny bit before that. When I came across the book, which you must know, by Ernest Kurtz, called "Not God," and that kind
Yeah,
of, you know, and that was his own research into the underneath the belly of the
yeah,
AA and the tenets and stuff, like really. So,
yeah, yeah, yeah.
um, yeah. Yeah, no, very interesting, really. Have you come to any conclusion as a consequence of your research yet, or is it still just stuff that you're working through and formulating about the nature of spirituality and recovery? Yes.
Well, I've, um, I mean, I've studied that concept of higher power for a long time,
Mm.
and for me, I think the key message that I would want to get out there is the diversity and creativity of people who engage with that concept, how they
Yeah.
interpret it, and I would want that to be more widely known, and kind of recognised in sort of professional and clinical circles, that these people are not just um, kind of sitting back and accepting a 1930s concept. They're engaging with it in active, agentic ways. You know, they're bringing their own experience and their own interpretation to it. But that's in relation to belief.